and welcome to Haunted Montreal's Spooky Story Sessions. I'm your host, Holly Rhiannon, and today I'm going to tell you all about the ghost of Jeanne Le Ber. With over 500 documented ghost stories, Montreal is easily the most haunted city in Canada, if not all of North America. Here at Haunted Montreal, we're dedicated to researching these paranormal tales, and our channel brings you videos in both French and English every second Saturday. Today we examine the ghost of Catholic recluse Jeanne Le Ber, one of Ville-Marie's most devoted and extreme religious residents. But before we get into today's story, please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell button so you get notified every time we have a new tale to share. And hey, if you're already subscribed, a big thank you and welcome back. We're so happy to have you. Now without further ado, let's get spooky. As the most haunted neighborhood in the city, Old Montreal witnesses many ghost sightings. On October 4th, 2014, Haunted Montreal was contacted by a woman in a panic. Her name was Nora, and she was a tourist from Texas who had recently attended a Haunted Montreal ghost walk in Griffintown. The following day, she decided to visit Old Montreal, which was the day she called Haunted Montreal to report something that upset her very much. After spending the day sightseeing, she turned the corner onto the Cours Royer to access the parking lot. As she approached her car, she was shocked to see a disheveled old woman lying on her stomach on the pavement beside her car. The lady was writhing about as though in pain. When Nora rushed over to help her, she couldn't help but notice the stench of blood. As she reached down to try and help the woman, she noticed two very strange things. Firstly, the woman was wearing some very coarse clothing, as though it was made from potato sacks. Secondly, the rear side of her shirt was shredded, and there was blood leaking all over her back. The woman was moaning in pain. Nora immediately called 911 to report the situation and get help as fast as she could. The dispatcher said an ambulance was nearby and would arrive within a few minutes. He told her how to administer first aid until the paramedics arrived. Nora hung up and pulled a handkerchief out of her purse to apply pressure to the wounds. However, when she looked down where the woman had been moments earlier, there was nothing to see but the asphalt of the parking lot. The bloodied old woman in the coarse clothing had vanished into thin air. The next thing Nora heard was the siren of the ambulance arriving. Two paramedics jumped out and rushed over. Nora was speechless and in a state of total shock. She didn't know how to explain why the bloodied woman was no longer there. She tried her best to explain what happened, and the ambulance technicians were puzzled. After a brief private discussion, they warned her that she was likely experiencing hallucinations and offered to drive her to an emergency psychiatry unit. Upset, Nora declined. When she called Haunted Montreal, she wanted to know if she was losing her mind or if there was another explanation. When Haunted Montreal told her that she had likely encountered the ghost of Jeanne Le Ber, especially as it was the 300th anniversary of her death, Nora was relieved. Jeanne Le Ber was born in 1662 in Ville-Marie to a very wealthy family. As she blossomed into a beautiful young woman, her parents would often dress her up in the finest clothing, ribbons, and latest fashions. Before long, she was one of the most eligible bachelorettes in all of New France. Her parents began inviting over dashing young men in high standing with the colony to woo her. However, young Jeanne Le Ber was repulsed by all of her suitors. She said that she didn't want to marry any of them. When her parents asked to whom she would marry, she told him that the only person she wanted to marry was God himself. When Jeanne Le Ber approached her priest for counsel, he advised to try being a recluse for 5 years. Jeanne spent the next 5 years locked in her bedroom in her father's house in total reclusion. Her loyal cousin, Anna Baroy, would bring her food every day. Jeanne refused to come out of her room, even for her brother's funeral. When she heard that the Notre Dame congregation was interested in building a new church next to their mother house, Jeanne Le Ber offered to pay for it, under one condition. Jeanne Le Ber wanted to live in a specially constructed apartment behind the altar in the new church so that she could be as close to God as possible. Marguerite Bourgeois, founder of the congregation and the Mother Superior, was thrilled and readily agreed to the proposal. In 1693, workers began building a 50 by 30 foot church called Notre Dame de Pitié, or Our Lady of Mercy. As promised, a small living space was created for Jeanne Le Ber behind the altar. On August 5th, 1695, a big religious ceremony was held in the church. Jeanne Le Ber, 33 years old at the time, took vows of perpetual seclusion, chastity, and silence. As the congregation looked on, she then entered her new apartment, and the door was closed behind her, never to be opened again until her death. The living conditions within her apartment were very primitive. There was no proper heating, no ventilation, and no natural light. She slept on a straw bed that got harder and harder as the years passed by. The only thing Jeanne Le Ber would eat were leftover scraps from the poor, which were sometimes moldy. These were served by her loyal cousin. She spent her time wearing uncomfortable horsehair shirts, sewing clothing for the poor, embroidering church vestments, praying for the colony, and prostrating herself before the altar every night. She was also known to self-flagellate. She used a scourge, a type of religious whip, to repeatedly lash her own back. She was frequently left bloodied by this devout act of self-punishment. In these dank and claustrophobic conditions, her health began to deteriorate until she caught pneumonia. She died from the disease on October 14, 1742, at the age of 52. After 19 years in seclusion, she was hailed as the Angel of Montreal and buried in the church's crypt near her father. Over 150 years later, in 1882, Catholic authorities decided to exhume her remains to ensure they were protected in the event she became a saint. In the Catholic Church, human remains of religious figures are very important. They are preserved and kept in reliquaries beneath the altars of important churches. However, when the bishop cracked open the tomb, a fine white dust dissipated on contact with the air. He believed that all traces of Jeanne Le Ber's remains had been lost. In 1911, the city of Montreal decided to demolish the Mother House and Notre-Dame de Pitié church with a view to extending Saint-Laurent Boulevard to the river. The Sisters of the Congregation then had to carry out a new exhumation to transport all the remains from the crypt to their new Mother House at Ville-Marie. Finally, in 1988, the decision was made to transfer the deceased sisters to the Côte-des-Neiges cemetery. While carrying out the exhumation in 1991, officials were surprised to find 2 epitaphs marking the location of a single tomb. One in the name of Jacques Le Ber and the other in the name of his daughter, Jeanne. With only one skeleton inside, they wondered if it was the father or the daughter. The bones were sent to a forensics laboratory, and in 1991, experts revealed that they were the remains of a female. Her skeleton had ground-down knees, and the 2 front teeth were damaged by notches. They concluded it was Jeanne Le Ber's remains on account of her frequent kneeling and using her teeth to cut threads for sewing. Today, the remains of Jeanne Le Ber rest in the Notre-Dame de Bon Secours chapel, where Sainte Marguerite Bourgeois also reposes. On October 28, 2015, the diocesan process for canonizing Jeanne Le Ber began in Montreal. This means that one day she could become the 5th saint from Montreal, also known as the City of Saints. The other Montreal saints include Marguerite Bourgeois, canonized in 1982, Marguerite de Youville, 1990, Brother André Basset, 2010, and Kateri Tekakwitha in 2012. Jean Mance and Jérôme Leroyer de la Dauversière are also venerated with the chance to one day become saints. If sainted, Jeanne Le Ber, the so-called Angel of Montreal, would become the only local saint who is also a ghost. Are you a Montreal resident or perhaps a tourist who has had a paranormal sighting of Jeanne Le Ber? If so, we would love to hear your story. Thank you so much for stopping by. If this is your first video, I hope you'll stick around for the next one. We post new videos in both French and English every second Saturday. If you'd like to learn more about the organization founded by the talented Donovan King, it's all listed in the description down below, along with links to purchase tickets to in-person haunted storytelling experiences. Remember to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'll have a new video out in a couple weeks, but until then, stay spooky.